the way we run ourselves today is really completely different. So I think, Dan, we wanted headquarters to be smaller. We wanted it to be really just about driving ideas throughout the company. And I thought it was really important for the company to be in the flow of ideas. I had spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley over the last 5 or 6 years, and I recognized the benefit of being in the flow of ideas really could mean for the company. It wasn't really practical to move there. We looked at Boston, which was really, we have 100,000 employees in Europe. We still have a big New England presence, so being on the East Coast mattered. And what we saw in Boston was just the opportunity to be around so many thinkers, so many schools, such a big venture community. And so from an energy standpoint, a healthcare standpoint, Boston was really quite good, in terms of where you go. And I just think, in an old, big company, you can never be scared enough, right? You can never be paranoid enough.
Right.
And so I think, Dan, at the end of the day, we saw in Boston the ability to be really a convener of ideas and in the flow of ideas. And I thought that would be a good, kind of kickstart for the company.
Right. And did your movement of moving the company to be more digital, is that tied into?
It absolutely ties in, but it wasn't the only reason. It wasn't the only reason to do it. Clearly, we've made a big push, like a lot of companies, into having a more digital framework, a more digital context. And it's hard to do that culturally unless you're really part of an ecosystem that's bigger. But, look, I think it's, we see in MIT and some of the other schools in the Boston area, some of the great minds of the 21st century, and we want to use that as a home field advantage. We think that's a real competitive advantage. And you see it with Stanford and the Valley. If you go spend any time out there, you see it every day. Yeah. And what we saw in Boston was really a vacuum. There are very few big companies in Boston, but there's a tremendous amount of venture companies in Boston, and we thought we could take advantage of that. We thought that the market for us could be quite good in terms of opportunities and thinking. So the digital thrust was a big part of it, but it wasn't the only part that we thought was important.
Right. I remember some years ago I asked you a naive question, which was, asked you, is it fun to own NBC and Universal Studios? And you looked at me very strangely and say, I think of them as businesses rather than as fun. And of course, you've exited from that business, you've exited from GE Capital. General Electric's changed a lot under you, and maybe talk about those changes.
So, Dan, I just think today, you can only be as broad as you are deep. Going back 15 years, the global economy was growing 4%. It was relatively easy to run a big multi-business conglomerate. It's a different world today. So what we've done is really kind of focus the company over time. Now, we're still a big, broad company, but really around high-tech infrastructure, kind of sales, service, global enterprises, high-tech enterprises, and that's been the footprint of the company. We've been a recent investor, let's say over the past 10 or 20 years, in the oil and gas business. But we bring a world of expertise to this industry in terms of material science, globalization, consumption, and things like that. When we owned NBC, my real value added was to say, let's make better shows next year. It wasn't like I had 15 ideas on new ways to do things. Today, the notion of a company like GE acquiring a media company, it would be insane, right? You wouldn't make it through the first morning with your investors. So the world changes, and I think what we've tried to do, Dan, is be really a connected industrial company. We're much deeper today. I became CEO of GE in 2001. We were 70% inside the United States. With the Alstom acquisition, we're 70% outside the United States in 2016.
Right.
That's a relatively short period of time. More in technology, more global, and I think this combination of a more focused portfolio that's deeper, and then add to that a digital thrust. That's really the company today.
So did that become clear over time, or was there an aha moment for you?
I think that was always where we were heading, right? Now, you're going to talk a lot this week about cycles. This is, the oil and gas cycle is kind of my fourth cycle since I've been CEO. In the early 2000s, we had a horrible aviation cycle. Right after 9/11, combination of 9/11 and SARS was quite difficult. There were 7 airlines around the world in bankruptcy simultaneously in 2002 and 2003. There was a lot of people in this room will remember there was a big power bubble in the United States. Yes. We went from shipping, I think, something like 220 heavy-duty gas turbines in 2002, just to the United States, to 5 2 years later. That's a cycle. Right. Financial crisis, that was a doozy. That was, and now the oil and gas cycle. So, sometimes events pace how quickly, we can move. Even a company like ours can move. But I think in some way, shape, or form, we wanted the company to be more technical, more global, closer to the customer, and be in businesses that promoted that over time. And that's really the direction we've headed in.
So having lived through these cycles, there's always a tendency in the bottom part of the cycle not to invest. How do you approach that?
Yeah, so look, Dan, again, it's easy for me to say, but I would say in the cycles I've been, if you made an investment in the aviation sector in 2002 or 3, you made a killing. We acquired Enron's wind business in 2003 for $200 million. Its annual revenue is like $7 billion today. I've made some not so good deals in my tenure. That's not one of them. That one worked okay. In the financial crisis, if you had a balance sheet that could acquire financial assets in 2009 or 2010, you've done quite well. So the first 3 cycles I've been in, if you had the courage of your conviction when the things were the darkest, you made a lot of money.
It does take courage.
So it takes courage. And I think in the world we live in today, we live in this world of slow growth and volatility. And the courage to act is ultimately what's going to differentiate one company from the next. So you always have to do what you have to do. If you're at cash cost with oil prices at $30 or wherever they are today, you've got to take action. But I think we look at this cycle in oil and gas, our balance sheet's quite strong. We believe in the efficacy of the industry over time as being a good GE business. So we think that these cycles, you have to focus on markets, you have to believe in self-help, you have to be really flexible with your customers and creative with your customers, and you have to keep a strong balance sheet with respect to what's going on. Now, I tell the team, I don't need you to tell me what the price of oil is today. I know what that is. And I don't need 100-page presentations, because when the real answer is, I don't know, you don't need 100 pages to say that, right? So
sometimes it helps.
Okay.
It helps.
It's okay, you sit up here and you hear projections on $80 or $100 or $40. I don't know. I sat up here with Dan, I think the first time in 2002 or 2003. Nobody talked about shale gas at that meeting. Nobody could see the cost of solar panels in that meeting. So the willingness to be agile and kind of compete through these cycles, I think, is a real strength. Conglomerates go in and out of style. GE sure has, right? In terms of what people think and how they look at multi-business structure versus single business structure. It is, in the volatile world we live in today, it is a massive advantage to have versatility, to have a portfolio. Right now, my aviation business, my power business, our healthcare business, it can pay for our oil and gas business while we go through this cycle.
Right.
This is an advantage a lot of people don't have. So I would say a multi-business structure is actually quite useful during a tough cycle like the one we're in today.
Do you see some things, you mentioned people didn't see shale gas and when you bought the wind business and so forth. Are there things that you're kind of making bets on now in the oil and gas or the power sector that people don't quite see right now, or that things that you find intriguing?
Look, I think it's being contrarian about emerging markets. So, we can have staying power in a place like Brazil. It was easy to be an investor in Brazil in 2011. It's hard to be an investor in Brazil today, right? But they're long on things that are worth a lot, right? The entrepreneurial class in Brazil is quite strong. So I think one of the things we can do, Dan, is we can be long in countries that are out of favor. I think we can use this as an opportunity to, what I would say is to fill in pieces of our portfolio, both on the power side and the oil and gas side, because it's more out of favor today than it's been in the past. We can look at that. I think it's just business model changes. This industry, because it was so rich, got very comfortable with a CapEx-only structure. It's going to go to more of a CapEx plus OpEx structure. The ability to do financing is going to be a tremendous value in that. So I think we're quite interested in exploring new business model opportunities. And then the last one, I think there's always technology around energy storage in particular that I find to be very intriguing, because that's, really, you talked about CCS earlier. I've been doing this a long time. I'm not so sure on that one.
Right.
Takes a ton of capital. The fundamental costs are high. Governments really aren't investing in it. It's going to be a struggle.
Right.
But storage actually has lots of activity going on with some interesting applications in there. So I think that's a place where I'd be long right now.
Right.
And then I just think there's going to be tremendous digital opportunities in both oil and gas and power,
right,
that are going to be quite intriguing. Right. So we're thinking, look, we're not, maybe it's just me, but I don't think we're not hamstrung by the cycle. I think a lot of people in this room, this is your third or fourth cycle. You know how to go through it. In our case, it may not be as much in oil and gas, but the rest of the company, I think we look at this as an opportunity to be an even better partner to the industry, right, than we've been before.
I saw in an interview you did, you talked about one of the advantages that GE would bring to the oil and gas industry is technical intensity and the fact that it's undercompeted. And I just wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, so no, let's say almost 20 years ago, or in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we really looked at the oil and gas industry as being core industry for the company, we never really tried to predict an oil price. In fact, in those days, the oil price was in the 20s, maybe lower. So we never really looked and said, the reason why we're going to invest in oil and gas equipment was because we think the price is going to be $150. Right. What we really saw was that as an industry, it was investing 1 or 2% of revenue back into R&D, and we compared it to the aviation business, which was quite big in GE, where people were investing 8% back into R&D. And so it wasn't that we thought oil and gas would go from 1% to 8%, but we didn't think it would stay at 1%. So I think that's what we meant by being more technically intense. And then I think, Dan, everybody in the room here today would say, okay, we have to find a way to get our costs down so that we can be competitive at $30 or $40 a barrel, but is also looking in the mirror and saying when pricing was at $100 or $120 a barrel, we weren't as competitive as we should have been or needed to be. And we're part of that. It's not that we're, I would say we have our part to do. The supply chain has its part to do. And that's what I mean by the fact that it's was a little bit undercompeted. I think it was allowed to be less efficient than it should have been when pricing was really good. Right. And all of us have to be on our game. Right. A combined cycle power plant has 1,000 hours of application engineering that goes into a combined cycle gas power plant. A subsea Christmas tree is 100,000 hours of application engineering. So it's 100-to-1 difference in the amount of customization that goes into a subsea Christmas tree than a combined cycle power plant. That's too much, right? So those are the opportunities, right, I think that the industry has ahead of it.
On the power side, of course, you have just recently closed a very large acquisition called Alstom. Why did you buy it?
Look, when you're in these core businesses that have been around a while, like oil and gas and power and industries like that, there's a finite number of companies on the game board. And when Alstom put itself in play, it was an opportunity that had already been analyzed inside GE 50 times, right? To say, if this ever happened, what would we do? What would the opportunities be? And that's the context with which we did it, Dan, is these opportunities come around once in a generation. They don't happen every day. When they come around, you have to know what you're doing and be willing to participate, which we were. It's not the best time in the cycle to be making a bet like this, but we have tremendous, I would say, internal capability to create shareholder value and customer value when we do it. And, we've done a lot of acquisitions in Europe over time. So we're very comfortable investing in Europe. We basically underwrite it, assuming we can export from Europe, assuming that we can do a good job with the installed base. And if the European market ever comes back, we basically get that for free. So we underwrite it not counting on the markets getting better.
Right.
And I think that's a smart way to do it. The way I would say something like Alstom is, it's heavy on execution. If we execute it well, it's strategically and financially very good for the company, very good for our customers, very good for our shareholders. But there's 100 ways to screw it up. So
But you're not going to.
we're humble about it. We're focused on it. We've got enough people working on it, and these are hard deals to do, but worth doing.
And just for the audience, what does Alstom bring that GE?
So basically think about GE big and gas, onshore wind, Alstom good offshore wind and coal power, hydro, Alstom brings. It increases our installed base by 50% in terms of power generation and dramatically increases our growth market footprint. Countries like Brazil, Egypt, Saudi, Africa, and the two of us together bring, I would say, a more competitive opportunity in the grid space.
Right.
So that's really the combination. And like I said, it just doesn't happen frequently. They have an opportunity to do it.
Right. So two terms that have been associated with GE, part of your vocabulary, are industrial internet and the GE store. And maybe just explain how those things work together.
Let me start with data and analytics and make, I think particularly in a room like this, in a conference like CIRA, just a couple observations. One is the nature of technology has changed. So if you think about oil and gas companies, power companies, everybody in this room, we've grown up around physics, we've grown up around combustion, we've grown up around material science, and those are really indigenous to all of our companies. In the future, analytics, now that our products are surrounded by data, in the future, analytics are going to be as important to everybody in this room as material science, point number one. So there's no choice. This is not something you can delegate to your CIO or anybody else. This is going to determine how well these products perform in the future. Number two, from 1990 to 2010, industrial productivity for all of us was about 4%. From 2010 to 2015, industrial productivity is 1%. Our productivity stinks. So we need a new way to think about how to drive productivity in our operations and with our customers. And the notion is that connectivity, just connecting assets, hasn't really driven much productivity. It's the combination of connected assets with real operating insight is what's going to make a difference in productivity. With our installed base of jet engines, commercial aviation, if we can save 1% on fuel performance, that's worth $3 billion of profit to all the airlines in the world, number two. Number three, in order to generate that productivity, it's a combination of the physics. How do the products wear? How does rotating equipment operate? And the analytics. So you can't get there without the machines. So part of our science, Productivity has been lacking, has to improve, and the industrial internet is about physics and analytics. Don't get yourself tied up in fancy words like industrial internet, Internet of Things, things like that. I think everybody in this room can identify with no unplanned downtime. Am I right? So if you can identify with no unplanned downtime, you can identify with the industrial internet. That's what it has to drive. So massive investment for us. We're investing well over $1 billion a year. We've been doing it for 5 or 6 years. This is big. G Store, what we really talk about inside the company is how do you make size and breadth an advantage and not a disadvantage. Size is a problem in and of itself. It creates bureaucracy. It creates many more good things than bad things. And unless we can use our breadth to say we can run an oil and gas business or a healthcare business better than our single competitors, we shouldn't be doing it. So, Dan, what we talk about is G Store allows us to drive scale, spread ideas, and create solutions, right? That's how we think about those two things as being key to the company. And ultimately, from an investor standpoint, that ought to relate to organic growth. So we target as a company 5% organic growth and margins and returns in the top quartile of our industry. Right. So that's the play. But the notion of being digital industrial, there's nothing fancy or trendy about it. This is really seminal to the future of the company and the future to everybody in this room.
Right. But so it means with a jet engine or a locomotive, getting a lot more information about how it's operating.
So you get it in the operating environment. So you take a shale gas field with submersible pumps that are now equipped with, probably each pump probably has a dozen sensors. So you're getting the heat, you're getting the temperature, you're getting the separation of the fluid, what's the composition of the fluid real time. And if you can get a 5% improvement in the oil recovery or gas recovery of that field, it monetizes itself right away. So the analytics are going to get more output from the heavy investment you've made. And then I would say increasingly what's going to be laid on top of that is a financing model that puts more at risk. Right. So you're going to get a combination of information, technology, and financing is all going to come together to really be driving more outcomes. And this is all about outcomes in the end. And you guys in oil and gas, or the guys in power in the business here today, know the difference that small changes make in terms of your productivity and your output. So a digital wind farm might get 4 points more availability of power or 4% more output. That's 20 points on your return. If you're a leveraged project finance company, that's another 20 points on your return, and that's where this is all going to go, right. Dan.
So before you spoke about not a great world economy right now, you have your fingers all over the world and could feel it. How does the global economy feel to you and the U.S.
Oh, look,
economy?
I think 16 feels similar to 15. Slow growth and volatility. U.S. is a little bit better. Europe is not as bad as it's been. Growth markets are highly differentiated. I would say China is still growing, but whereas China used to be a macro story, it's more of a micro story today. Not every sector is going to do well. Some sectors are doing better than others. And I just think we're into a period of slow growth and volatility. I just read 2 interesting books. One is called The Only Game in Town, which is really about how central banks have really impacted the global economy. And the other one is The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which I recommend everybody in here
that's Robert Gordon.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really, I would say what it really says is if you're in here and you're running a company or a small business, small or big business, you need to just really get yourself accustomed to slow growth and volatility. So in a world of slow growth and volatility, you need courage to act because you're in the self-help business. You're not in the capturing tailwind business, you're in the self-help business. You need to be really resilient because you're going to manage your way through multiple cycles and you need to be agile. You've got to be very fast and flexible inside your companies. I don't see, Dan, I don't see anything changing. It's not terrible. You know, the fourth quarter of 2008, that was terrible, right? GDP declining 7%, 800,000 people losing a job every month. That was a dark time. These aren't dark times. And let me tell you, if you were in my seat in financial services in the fourth quarter of 2008, you think 2016 is awesome. I mean, by comparison, these are like happy days, okay? But I think this whole notion of slow growth and volatility and everything it creates, wealth discrepancy, underemployment, and that's happening in every corner of the world. That's kind of what we think about inside the company.
It is, 2016 is a presidential year and being nonpartisan. Are there some policies that you would like to see come to the fore that would be good for the economy?
Well, I think it's about growth, really, at the end of the day, in terms of what we would do. I would say, broadly speaking, Dan, there's a couple reforms that would be meaningful. I think tax reform, immigration reform, things like that. I chaired President Obama's Jobs and Competitiveness Council, and what we worked on were four things that I see in every economy around the world, which is infrastructure, a real focus on training and education, a tremendous need to develop small and medium-sized business, and regulatory reform. Some form of those. We've made it almost impossible for a small and medium-sized company to prosper today. And these are the kinds of things, and until we get that, it's going to be awfully hard. But I would say, Dan, when you're watching the election process we're going through right now, it's difficult to imagine big things getting done.
Right.
And I think it's...
Yes.
It's important to remember that primarily what you're going to elect as an American in November is who your regulators are going to be.
Yeah.
In other words, I think big legislation in this environment is quite hard, but think about in this room the importance of the EPA, the Department of Justice. I can go down, the Federal Reserve. They're going to have a huge impact in terms of what it's like to do business and how we go forward. So I would keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking through where the world goes.
So you mentioned at the beginning that it's quite different managing a conglomerate today, and that leads to a question to kind of tie this together. Really, how the role of the CEO has changed during the time you've been in this job, and how you're thinking about the role of the CEO has changed.
I think it's a great question. So I became CEO of GE in 2001, and it's now 2016. And this is going to sound really simplistic, but probably the biggest difference is just macro. From I joined GE in 1982 until I became CEO in 2001. The U.S. economy growing 4%, the world at peace, basically a pro-business headset. There was just a completely different background noise in terms of what it means to run a company. All of the macro environment items in 2001 are extremely different today. Slow growth world, the world at war, very difficult relationship between business and government, more populism, less globalization by far. So the world behind you is quite different. And Dan, I come back to a profound sense for action. You really have to know what you believe in, what your strategy is, and be willing to drive that day and night. Be a much better risk manager. So fundamentally, I grew up in a company that was built on centralized controls. The days of centralized controls, those days are over. We're in the risk management business today. What's going to be the downside? What's going to be the upside? How do you make those choices accordingly? Flexibility. anytime somebody says, well, we did it this way in 2006, or we did it this way in 1998, or we did it this way in 2010, you just have to throw them out of the room. You know, it's just you live every day is completely different than the day before. And then I just think this tremendous commitment to hiring the best people and making sure that the best people want to come to work for you, no matter where they're from. You know, fighting for talent each and every day, that remains. So you can't be freaked out by the macro. You just can't let that determine your strategy. You can't read your strategy in the FT or the Wall Street Journal. You've got to have it in your own head. You got to be a great risk manager today. You've got to be extremely flexible, and you have to just love people and what they can do and what they mean, how to hire, how to recruit, how to motivate. That's what it takes.
Right. Jeff, you've been an extraordinary CEO. It's been our privilege now 3 times
Thanks.
to have you here, and really thank you very much for sharing your thinking and your wisdom.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was terrific. That was really terrific. Thank you.
See you, Dan.
Thank you.